the mainstream media can really be shown to be unreliable on this issue, that's a crack in their monopoly of the narrative if they can be shown to be untrustworthy. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another LGB Alliance USA weekly news roundup. We are here with Carol, Joss, and me, Ariane. First, I'll begin with our summary of the stories we shall discuss today. A court allows a bill protecting female sports and banning pediatric transition to go into effect in Ohio. Vice President and Democratic presidential candidate Kamala Harris selects as her running mate Tim Walz, the Minnesota governor with a controversial record in favor of gender ideology. A 20-year-old detransitioner is suing Planned Parenthood. Hilary Cass writes a scathing letter expressing concerns about adult gender transition services. Billy Beane, the second openly gay Major League Baseball player, dies at 60. And more controversy and protests erupt over the inclusion of XY athletes in women's boxing at the Paris Olympics. So first, Carol, tell us what you've got.
Thanks, Ariane. So Ohio Bill HB 68 has been deemed legal and allowed to go into effect. This bill will make it illegal to provide medical transition interventions to underage youth. It will also mandate that all school sports and locker rooms remain sex segregated. The bill had been scheduled to already be in effect, but was blocked in March when the ACLU filed suit on behalf of two 12-year-old boys who identified as girls. Judge Michael Holbrook had stopped the bill from becoming law until the suit could be settled in court. On August 6th, Judge Holbrook's decision was made. He wrote in his decision, quote, that HB 68 doesn't violate Ohio's single subject rule for legislation, and that it doesn't violate the state's health care freedom constitutional amendment. He also wrote that it doesn't violate either the Equal Protection Clause or the Due Course of Law Clause. This week, Kamala Harris selected Minnesota Governor Tim Walz as her vice president running mate. So who is Tim Walz? Well, according to a recent Washington Post article, quote, before he joined the Democratic presidential ticket, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz had emerged as one of the most prominent champions for transgender rights and gender-affirming care as legislators restricting access proliferated across the country. Tim signed an executive order that made Minnesota a, quote, trans refuge state. In the following months, he signed Bill 146 that enshrined into law Minnesota's trans sanctuary status. According to Bill HF 146, the state will not honor another state's child custody ruling if that ruling restricts the transgender medicalization of a child. So what does this mean for the country and those of us who are trying to stop the medicalization of children? It remains to be seen, but in my opinion, it's not looking good. We definitely have our work cut out for us. Joss?
Thanks, Carol. As you'll remember from previous reporting, Dr. Hilary Cass conducted a 4-year intensive study commissioned by NHS England to make recommendations on how to improve NHS gender services for children and young people. In short, the study found extensive flaws in gender-related care and recommended a complete overhaul to care services with the goal that each patient be considered holistically and not solely in terms of their gender-related distress. At the time, Dr. Cass did not evaluate adult gender-related services in her review, but has since sent a letter of concern to National Director and the National Medical Director of NHS England regarding adults. As of August 7th, NHSE haven't addressed the letter, but instead published an update to their plan of action regarding Cass's recommendations for children's gender services. Let's take a moment to talk about key points from Dr. Cass's letter about adult service concerns. Many clinicians said there were often extremely complex comorbidities in patients, and none of those clinical issues were addressed or taken into account before prescribing cross-sex hormones. Clinicians found it difficult to defend the decision to not prescribe hormones except in extreme cases, like when a patient presented with multiple personalities. And if the clinician did delay or balk in any way, their practice was monitored and clamped down on. Essentially, there were virtually no contraindications to patients receiving cross-sex hormones and the delivery of such was expected to be expedited. Clinicians expressed concerns to Cass that consent procedures were inadequate and that the patients didn't understand the risks of vaginal atrophy, osteoporosis, or the extremely rapid effect of taking testosterone, along with the irreversibility of some of the interventions. Several clinicians described their patients displaying quote unquote magical thinking, which was reported as unrealistic expectations about medical transition procedures, likely due to watching social media videos. This led to patient dissatisfaction with medical outcomes. Clinicians reported that there were no national guidelines or standards of care when prescribing hormones, and we've heard those same concerns echoed in the US by detransitioned women. Possibly the most troubling was a perception from some clinicians that the gender care approach was ideologically driven and polarized, which made it difficult to question the approach or discuss concerns. There was essentially a philosophy that it was up to the patients to make their own mistakes. And that's a really hard pill to swallow when those mistakes are often irreversible. So if this is all happening in the UK, why should we care about it here in the US? Well, it's happening here too. The troubling part about what's happening in the US is that we have no US version of the Cass review. Instead, our medical associations like the American Academy of Pediatrics and the Endocrine Society continue to back gender pseudoscience. And this brings me to my second story. Jennifer Block of the Free Press asks how Planned Parenthood became one of the country's largest suppliers of testosterone. In her article, Block tells us the story of Christina Heinemann and another young woman who goes by Anna. Both women had eerily similar stories of starting testosterone after a roughly 30-minute consultation at a Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood, which is best known as the largest single provider of abortion, contraception, reproductive care, and sex education in the US, has also, in less than a decade, become the country's leading provider of gender transition hormones. In her reporting, Block discovered there were about 24 clinics offering gender services at Planned Parenthood in 2015, and now it's available at nearly 450 of their 600 nationwide clinics. Nearly 40,000 patients went to Planned Parenthood for gender services in 2023, with approximately 40% of them being between the ages of 18 and 22 years old. Two of those former patients are the two women I mentioned earlier that are now suing Planned Parenthood for medical malpractice. In both cases, Christina and Anna are neurodivergent, same-sex attracted young women, convinced by social media and their peers that transition would alleviate all of their problems. Christina likens it to being brainwashed. What ultimately happened is that cross-sex hormones and medical interventions harmed both women. Their lawsuits are an effort to make sure the same fate does not befall other people like them. So how did Planned Parenthood get into gender medicine? In 2005, a pilot program serving male to female patients started in Santa Cruz by Dr. Jen Hastings. By 2015, two physicians who were against gatekeeping, which is what they call requiring mental health evaluation prior to treatment, and who supported medical intervention as early as possible, started advising Planned Parenthood. Those physicians were Dr. Madeline Deutsch and Dr. Johanna Olson-Kennedy. Many of you are likely familiar with the video of Olson-Kennedy crassly declaring colleagues in 2018 about patient regret around mastectomy that if you want breasts at a later point in your life, you can go get them. And hers was a very par for the course mentality around gender-related care. Just like clinicians in the UK describing patients being left to make their own mistakes, that is the same mentality that existed as gender treatments were ramping up at Planned Parenthood, and that mentality still persists from US medical providers today. According to Block, Planned Parenthood shared a video on social media telling teens, your gender identity is real. You should be the one to decide what changes you make to your body. Another Planned Parenthood doctor stated, gatekeeping is not necessary. People are the experts of their own body and their own journey, and as long as they can make decisions, they should be the agent of their own healthcare. So here in the US, we have Olson-Kennedy and gender madness, and the UK has Dr. Cass. For their failures, NHS England has made fairly rapid response changes based on Dr. Cass's review, and if the Cass review did nothing else, it opened the door to debate, discussion, and allowing clinicians to express their concerns without fear of being sanctioned or derided as transphobes. In fact, Hannah Barnes writes in the New Statesman that hundreds of doctors, nearly 900, have written a letter of dismay and disappointment to the British Medical Association's Council Chair about the BMA's criticism of the Cass review. But in the US, we're behind the times. In so many instances, the people who are harmed the most by gender medicine are lesbian, gay, or bi. We have to urge our medical providers and the industry at large to stop behaving like insolent children. We have to demand medical practitioners learn from countries around the globe who have opted to truly try to do no harm. And now to you, Ariane.
That was an excellent overview of the state of gender medicine in the US and the UK. Now we'll turn to sports. We're remembering Billy Beane, the groundbreaking baseball player and advocate for LGBTQ+ inclusion, who has passed away at 60. Beane, known for his outfield skills with the Detroit Tigers, Dodgers, and Padres, died from acute myeloid leukemia. Beane made history not just for his athletic prowess, but as the second Major League Baseball player to come out as gay. He retired in 1995, feeling the sport wasn't ready for an openly gay player. Yet he later became the MLB's first ambassador for inclusion and served as senior VP of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion starting in 2014. Despite his impactful post-baseball career, Beane's journey was marked by challenges. He spent nearly a decade concealing his sexuality from teammates and the public. His memoir, Going the Other Way, reveals the intense personal and professional pressures he faced. Beane's legacy includes pioneering efforts like Baseball Spirit Day, a campaign for supporting LGBTQ+ youth. MLB Commissioner Rob Manfred praised Beane for making baseball better both on and off the field through his empathy and commitment to inclusion. Beane's influence extended beyond the diamond, shaping the way sport approaches diversity and acceptance. His story remains a powerful reminder of courage and change in the face of adversity. And now we're going to return to the story of the boxers at the Olympics. The two boxers are Algeria's Imane Khalif and Taiwan's Lin Yuting, who were both cleared to compete in the Olympics despite failing sex verification tests commissioned by the International Boxing Association, or IBA. Last week, we mentioned that the IBA released a statement confirming that Khalif and Lin failed a test that was not a testosterone test, strongly suggesting that the test they failed was a genetic chromosome test, namely a test showing that they have male XY chromosomes instead of female XX chromosomes. Since last week's news roundup, the IBA convened a press conference on Monday, August 5th, confirming that their tests showed that Lin and Imane are male. Furthermore, that same day, the IBA released another statement on their website. Amongst other things, they claim that they did, in fact, alert the International Olympic Committee, or IOC, about Khalif and Lin's sex testing results, contradicting the IOC's claims that they didn't know about them. They even offered a copy of the email they sent to the IOC, as well as a copy of the IOC's acknowledgement of receipt email. They also clarified that, due to medical privacy laws, they cannot release Lin and Khalif's official test results. However, they said the tests were done twice in order to validate their accuracy. They also said that both athletes ultimately decided not to appeal their disqualification, which is awfully suspicious if these athletes truly are innocent of the charge of being male. Meanwhile, Lin and Khalif have qualified to the women's boxing 57 kilogram and 66 kilogram finals, respectively. But the women they have defeated aren't all passively accepting the injustice. Ezra Yildiz Kahraman, the Turkish athlete who lost to Lin in the semifinals, crossed her fingers in an X symbol following her loss, ostensibly in protest of male athletes' participation in the women's category. Now, many gender-critical, sex-realist women have adopted this gesture as a protest symbol in favor of the integrity of women's sports. From Paris to San Francisco, women all over the world are protesting. But the IOC doesn't care, and in fact are doubling down on refusing to do genetic testing and change their eligibility requirements to disqualify male athletes competing as women. The IOC needs to realize that While they can ignore us all they want to, the credibility of the Olympic Games, as well as the rights and safety of female athletes, are at stake. And let's be clear, while LGBTQ groups like GLAAD have defended Lynn and Khalif, defending male athletes who compete as women is not an LGBTQ issue. There are lesbian and queer women, as well as females who identify as trans but haven't taken testosterone, who compete in women's boxing and are also seeing their opportunities denied due to the inclusion of male athletes in the women's category. Women can be of any sexual orientation and identify however they want to, but they are still women, and their rights should not be trampled on in the name of LGBTQ. And with that, do we have any further discussion on what's going on with the Olympics? I know it's been people around here, the gender critical women that I've been speaking to are just can't stop talking about this. Have you been hearing about it too?
I've seen all the X's on X lately. I was like, what is happening here? Then I saw the pictures, but you know what? Honestly, after the first go around with that whole thing, I just have been ignoring it. It just makes me too mad.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm glad to see that, some of the women there are actually doing some protesting, because that's what needs to happen ultimately. The women in the sports need to really protest it, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I know one of the Italian athletes who lost against, I think it was Khalif, maybe it was Lynn. She initially did complain and then sort of apologized and retracted that. And I'm assuming she must have faced a lot of pressure to do that.
Yeah. I don't know, maybe it's just me, but if I was in that situation, I think I would just be like, well, it's a loss now. It's all lost anyways. So why not just, say what I want?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. Maybe that's not how it works exactly, but like, I don't know. I would just think, well, I'm already lost my chance here because I'm not going to win against a man who's at the top of his performance in the same sport.
Yeah, it just seems very dangerous for the women to even have to compete. And that's what you mentioned about that, Ariane, was really important to punch it home, because it's the danger component. On Instagram, I noticed today someone had posted that XX is blocked on Meta. So if you hashtag XX, it now breaks community guidelines on Facebook, and I'm sure also Instagram, because it's the same company. But yeah, just XX is enough to break community guidelines. So I don't know at what point this went into effect, but this is now a thing also.
Do we know this for sure? Have you checked it?
I didn't check it myself. I saw the screenshot of the XX and I shared it on our story for today. But yeah, it's worth trying and seeing if you try XY, does it also break community guidelines?
So many of these rules are very inconsistently applied, I've noticed. It's the same thing. I sometimes hear scare stories about people saying lesbian gets censored because of the porn connotations in some social media places or some search engines or something, but it's obviously not consistently applied. So I wouldn't be surprised if something like that was happening with XX.
I know TikTok had an issue with the word lesbian, and women would find workarounds to try to still create content for lesbians and drive lesbian viewers to their content. But I don't know about XX on TikTok. And I don't know that lesbian has been banned on Meta. So the consistency thing is just really.
Well, this goes back to the community guidelines nonsense. Like, who's making these decisions and what guidelines are we adhering to? Like, it's okay to have, we should have some community guidelines, right? We shouldn't be allowing porn or maybe certain harsh language, I guess, like, swearing or something, if they wanted to include that. I mean, I don't think you should, but like, if they wanted to do something like that, but not just stuff that people disagree with, not just hot button issues. That would be like making sure that no one could talk about abortion or something else, some other hot button issue,
Right. And that was one of the things that was alarming to me about the IBA conference, where news organizations, like the reports that news organizations like Reuters and others cut their feed. Did you see that also, Ariane? That the IBA was at the IBA conference, news agencies were just like, we're not gonna invest in any more time in this.
Well, I've noticed that the coverage from mainstream news agencies has been just absolutely atrocious, and I think that contributes to why I think Meta feels like they can censor on this issue. Though, if the mainstream media considers something misinformation, then that sort of is a trigger word to be like, oh, this isn't a thing that reasonable people can disagree on. This is just a question of right and wrong. And it's just wrong to call these athletes male. And that to me is the thing that makes me angry. I don't blame random people on the street for not properly understanding this issue or for not understanding DSDs, because that's not something that's taught in your high school biology course typically. But I do fault the mainstream media for either just being completely stupid and intellectually lazy and not doing their homework, or being deliberately misleading.
I'm gonna side on the deliberate part, right? Because we know there's a whole lot of money behind the trans movement, and this fits into the trans movement, right? This fits into letting men go and do whatever they want. So I suspect they're being told to shut up about it because it's not inclusive.
Yeah, that sounds right. And I'd also say too, just the crowd of people on social media that were defending Lynn and Khalif is a very eclectic mix, in that you do have your typical progressive, pro TQ plus progressive, whatever you woke, whatever you want to call it types. But then you also have these nationalists from Algeria and Taiwan who aren't necessarily pro-trans. I mean, I don't think there are very many trans rights advocates in Algeria, but are just saying it because they don't want to make their country look bad, I imagine. And that's a whole different cultural angle to it.
I really wish that there was better biology education. I wonder if that's why we've gotten here. I mean, because there is very much a difference between males and females in strength and in bone density. Like the men's bones are like thicker and tougher and harder to break than women's. Like that's they have a longer wingspan. They have a longer arm span, just across the board. They have bigger lungs, bigger hearts. They have better oxygen and capacity to pump blood through their system. All these things exist. And so that's why it's a disadvantage. Like it just boggles my mind that people don't know this. I know some people probably just know this and choose not to believe, but I do think a lot of people don't understand it.
That's what I'm concerned about. The people that know it, that choose to not talk about it, or to actually provide misinformation and perpetuate paradigms and notions that are not real about biology being a spectrum or yada yada. There's so much nonsense that has been swept into all of this. Who do you trust? And what do you do when you have social media giants and news agencies, mass media, that shut down dissent or just won't address it at all? So you can't have a conversation about it.
And how creepy and gaslighty is it to tell people they're women when everybody looking at these dude, especially the one from, was it Algeria?
Mm-hmm.
Looks straight up like a dude. Like we're all lesbians here. We've seen some really masculine looking women. And it's like, that's a dude.
Yeah. And also I think part of it's a lack of biological understanding, also a lack of sort of probabilistic understanding or mathematical understanding, in that I think a lot of people are saying, well, Lynn and Khalif did lose to women in previous matches, or they'll point to examples of some male athlete losing to women and use that as proof that it doesn't matter. Well, no, being male gives you an advantage over females. It doesn't mean that every male in the world is always going to defeat every woman in the world every time. And I've seen, like, recently some friends of mine encountered a woman who claimed that because she does martial arts and she fights against men in martial arts, she doesn't think it's a big deal. And it's like, well, there's a big difference between just being part of a local club and having amateurs fight amateurs and dealing with the absolute top of the cream of the crop of competition. It's the same thing if you look at results for the Boston Marathon, for example. I just was curiosity. I looked at the results. There's overlap between in the men and the women's results. There are women that defeat men, or, have better scores than men. But when you get to the top 30 or so of the men's times, that's better than all the women's times. Once you get to the top, the elite, that's when you start getting real obvious disparities between men and women. I think a lot of people are having a hard time understanding that. And I do think it's also something that people pointed out with Lynn and Khalif, that the fights that they lost were when they were very young and inexperienced, and they were fighting against more experienced female players.
Well, here's the thing, because how long has he been fighting against women? Since the beginning? He could be a super average dude. We don't know if he's a top dude. Could he go hold his own with the male athletes of his same, the same in the Olympics? That's the other thing. A lot of mediocre men can climb the ranks in women's divisions where the women are at the peak, and these guys are like old, average, and still beating them. So there's another issue there too. If you look at any of the records, time records of all sports across the board, men's times are always above women's for the most part. Swimming, racing, everything, they're always higher.
Yeah, and I think it's also, worth pointing out too, like, one thing that makes it particularly egregious with boxing is that it's a contact sport, so there is that safety element. With the whole Caster Semenya track thing, I mean, that was unfair, that Caster Semenya could beat women athletes, but Caster Semenya wasn't really endangering the safety of the people.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's
It's
another
really bad, and if you're endangering safety, just like it would be stupid, really dangerous to have a heavyweight fighting a featherweight.
exactly. Oh God, I hope this starts to just pique people and get and they need to just do testing straight across the board. It doesn't matter. There's testing. Do the testing. Make it fair.
Yes, and I hope the media, the mainstream media, is discredited for their reporting. That's what I really want to see. If the mainstream media can really be shown to be unreliable on this issue, that's a crack in their monopoly of the narrative if they can be shown to be untrustworthy.
That's true. That's a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's I think a beautiful place to end it.
Yes. Thank you everyone for watching this week's news roundup. We hope to see you again next week. Also, make sure to check out our website for information about our future events and information on how to donate. We'll have the link to our website in the notes. Thank you, everyone.